Good day, everyone. I am Wennamae Fiecas, and together with my partner, Angelica Rendor, we will be presenting Reading 7 of our Philosophy 1 class, which includes the works of Saint Anselm, the Ontological Argument, and Saint Thomas Aquinas, the Five Ways. Before we start discussing the Ontological Argument, let us first get to know Saint Anselm. Saint Anselm is a member of the Benedictine Order and the Bishop of Canterbury. He is also considered the father of scholastic philosophy. His works emphasize linguistic and analytical thinking. He upheld the Augustine tradition of desire to believe to comprehend the truth and existence of God rather than understanding to believe. Saint Anselm, unlike other theologians, is not scared of skepticism, since he believes that reason is required to interpret and validate religion. During the medieval period, scholasticism was the dominant response to intellectual and theological concerns. Saint Anselm's works are based predominantly on reasons, where he presents the argument as an explanation of the Christian faith. The core of his argument is his realization that if God is described as a being greater than which no greater can be conceived, then God cannot be conceived of as not existing, since perfection requires existence. Now that we know him, let us begin understanding Saint Anselm's The Ontological Argument. Think of the greatest things you can imagine. It could be anything realistically possible or impossible. For Saint Anselm, the greatest thing that we can ever imagine is God. But what is this greatest thing? For one to be the greatest thing, it must not exist in the understanding alone, but it must also exist in reality. To be existent in reality is greater than existing in the minds only. Anselm tells us, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding or in the mind alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived. This means that if a being exists in the understanding alone, there still is something greater than that being which exists in reality. Therefore, there is doubt that the greatest being exists both in the understanding and in reality. Continuing, Saint Anselm says that it is possible to conceive a being that always exists, and it is always greater than a being that can be non-existent. Hence, it is said that if that than which nothing greater can be conceived, or the greatest being can be non-existent, then it cannot be considered the greatest thing. Therefore, we can say that there truly is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. This being always exists to the extent that it cannot be non-existent. And this is God. Saint Anselm says that God cannot be conceived not to exist. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That which can be conceived not to exist is not God. This means that for Saint Anselm, God is the greatest thing we can imagine. And he cannot be conceived to be non-existent. For anything that can be conceived to be non-existent is not God, because God always exists. If our minds can imagine a being better than God, it would only imply that the creature is greater than the creator. And Saint Anselm says that this is most absurd. For anything else can be conceived to be non-existent, except God alone. Anyone who understands who God is can understand that God is a being that truly exists and cannot be non-existent. For God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. To conclude St. Anselm's idea, he says that the greatest thing can exist in the understanding or in the mind, as well as in reality. But those existing in reality are always greater than those things existing in our understanding only. God is the greatest thing that we can ever imagine. God cannot exist in the understanding alone, as he would not be the greatest thing in this situation. A being conceived in reality will be considered greater than him. Therefore, God must also exist in reality for him to be the greatest thing, or that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Moving on to the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, he offered the 5 ways. This is also known as the 5 proofs for the existence of God. In his Magnus Opus, or the greatest work, the Summa Theologiae, which is a textbook for men in their priestly formation. Although the 5 ways take up only a page in the book, it is considered the most commented section of the Summa and the most well-known argument for the existence of God. But we are to note that even though each way ends with a conclusion of a variation of this we call God, the 5 ways was not intended to illustrate a uniquely Christian God. Additionally, it is not created to show that God is a perfect and omnipotent being. Rather, the 5 ways was written to show that there is something uncaused that causes other things, or something necessary and does not have a necessary existence from another.
Now that we have introduced St. Aquinas' work, let us go and discuss each of his 5 ways. The first way is the argument from motion. This focuses mainly on motion. When we say motion, we mean the 3 sorts of accidental change that Aristotle differentiated, namely change of location, change in quality, and change in quantity. The general idea of the argument is that anything that has been changed was changed by something else or a changer. The changer either changes itself or remains the same when it changed the first thing. But a series of changing changers cannot proceed infinitely. So, there must be some first unchanged being. This being is God. To further elaborate, to effect motion means to make something from potentiality into actuality. But only a being that is in actuality is able to change something in potentiality. For example, something hot in actuality, like a fire, makes a piece of wood, which is hot in potentiality, to be hot in actuality. In this scenario, we can say that the fire moved and altered the piece of wood by making it hot. Take note that a thing cannot be both a mover and the one being moved. In simpler words, it is impossible for something to move itself. Therefore, everything that is moved must be moved by another. If B moves A, B is moved by another thing, C. C is then moved by another thing, D, and so on. But if this series of movers went on infinitely, then there would be no first mover, which means that there would be no motion. Therefore, there has to be some first mover that is not moved by anything, and this is God. The second way is the argument from causation, which focuses on an ordered series of efficient causation. An efficient cause is the one that produces or alters something. An ordered series is the one in which the casual work from the later members in the series depends on the simultaneous casual work of earlier members. A fire heating the kettle and the kettle heating the water is an example of ordered series, since the heating of water depends on the activity of the earlier cause, which is fire. In sensible things, there is an ordered of efficient cause, and it is not possible for one to be an efficient cause of itself. It is also impossible to go on to infinity among efficient cause. For in every case of ordered efficient cause, the first is a cause of intermediate, and the intermediate is a cause of the last. If there were no first among the efficient cause, then there wouldn't be a last or an intermediate. Similarly, if the efficient cause went on to infinity, there would be no first, intermediate, or last efficient cause. Therefore, there must be some first efficient cause, which is God. The third way is the argument from possibility to necessity. Aquinas has a specific understanding of possibility and necessity, and it is not the common understanding we have of it today. Aquinas meant necessary as something that cannot be generated or corrupted. A possible being, on the other hand, exists, but it could have come into existence by composition, and it may also cease to exist by decomposition. Things in the world are able to exist and cease to exist. If a thing is possible to be non-existent, then at one time it did not exist. However, it is impossible for everything to be like this because it would mean that at some point, nothing in the world exists. If this were true, then nothing would exist even in the present, for a being only beings to exist through something that already existed beforehand. But there are things that exist in the world right now, therefore, there must be something impossible to not exist, like a necessary being whose necessity is not from something else. We call this necessary being whose necessity came from nothing, God. The fourth way is the argument of gradation. The argument tells us that there are varying degrees of things, which means that there exists a thing that is more or less good, more or less true, or more or less something in general. If this is so, then there must be a thing that is maximally something. For example, there is something maximally good, maximally true, and so on. If a thing is maximally something, then it is considered a maximal being. This maximal being is the cause of the perfection and the goodness of all things, and this being is God. Finally, the fifth way is the argument from the governance. In the world, there are things that lack cognition and only act for the sake of the end, such as natural bodies. It is not by chance, but by design, that they attain the end to obtain the best result. But we know that something that lacks knowledge cannot move towards the end unless they are directed by something that has cognition and intelligence. For example, an arrow cannot direct itself to the target on its own. It needs an archer to guide it. Therefore, we can say that beings in nature are directed by something, and we call this director of unthinking things God. To conclude, the 5 ways described by St. Aquinas that gives proof of God's existence. The first way is the argument from motion, which states that everything is moved by another, since nothing can move without a mover, which is God. The second way is the argument from causation. This way states that an efficient cause is done with an order. It is unattainable to be an efficient cause of oneself, and there must be first efficient cause, which is God. The third way is the argument from possibility and necessity, which states that everything in the world exists because of a necessary being, God, whose necessity arose from nothing. The fourth way is the argument from gradation, which states that God is the one who causes the perfection and the goodness of all. The last way is the argument from the governance, which claims that God is the director of thoughtless things and that all things in nature are guided by Him. And that brings us to the end of the report. We hope you learned something from our presentation. Thank you and have a great day.